Okay, that's not a picture of me, okay? Um, for those of you who are Mike Myers fans, that's a version of Dr. Evil. Although I'm best known as in the social network community as someone who has developed and extended a measure of centrality, I have another life. I'm also a social psychologist, and I've done study on power within exchange networks. And recently I've become aware of kind of the moral implications of this work. Let's see how this works. Okay, but before I begin my talk, I want to express my indebtedness to my teachers, the people who taught me so much when I was in graduate school. My co-authors, some of whom are here. The people I've worked with over the years, and then this is a list that I didn't think I might not show, but these are people to whom I feel deeply indebted in the network community. People who have influenced me a lot. The funny thing is, I don't even like all these people. Okay. But nevertheless, and some of them I positively dislike, but nevertheless, they've influenced me. Okay. I'm not going to be talking about the evil that networks can accomplish. Okay? And I'm not going to be discussing the evil uses of social network methods. Okay? of which there's some. Okay, what I'm going to be discussing is kind of what might be thought of as distributive evil. The topic of distributive justice is very important in social psychology. There's been a lot of work on distributive justice. But there are natural tendencies in the world toward distributive injustice. After all, we have a norm of distributive justice, in part because there are tendencies in the world toward injustice. We have norms whenever there's something that has to be countered, some natural human tendency that needs to be countered. What is distributive evil? Well, to me at least, they are actions that increase one's own reward while the collective benefits decline, or actions that increase inequality in outcomes without any increase in the overall benefits. Forms of distributive evil in networks, okay, violations of trust, for instance, Madoff's work. Using conflict or distrust among others to further one's own gains. Selfishly withholding information from the group. Betrayal of a group by distributing information to others. Or exploitation of others who are dependent on oneself through lack of reciprocity. Okay, now, so I'm talking about distributive rules and distributive injustice. And I thought of kind of a hierarchy of principles of exchange. One of them is, of course, the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Which is consistent with doing something for people who do nothing for oneself. You treat people as you would like to be treated yourself. And in these diagrams, the length of the arrow refers to the amount of good that's done for the other person. The second principle, which is not quite so altruistic morally, is to do unto others as they do unto you, to reciprocate people's behavior, people's rewards, to treat others in proportion to what they do to oneself. Now, a third, the lowest level is exploitation, to take advantage of others, to exert power so that one gives others less than they give oneself. And part of the idea here is reciprocity. Reciprocity and trust are often kind of mixed up in our minds. But I want to distinguish two kinds of meanings of reciprocity. There's a tremendous amount of work on the prisoner's dilemma. And here, reciprocity means cooperating while others cooperate. It means not selfishly keeping one's goods to oneself, but rather behaving in an unselfish way. But I want to distinguish something else. I want to distinguish, that's one dimension, and clearly it's kind of a good-bad dimension. It's called cooperation versus defection. Clearly there's a moral component to this. I want to distinguish another moral component, and that is treating others reciprocally versus exploiting those who are dependent on one. One of them is a force for equality, and the other produces more inequality. Now, I want to tell a kind of little drama. Imagine, for instance, a boy and a girl who are in a relationship together. Suppose that another boy enters the picture. The girl now has two suitors. She can, if she's not bound by the principle of monogamy, she can try to maintain relationships with both of them because she'll have power over both of them. Both of them might be very anxious to please her, but she can treat them equally. Now suppose that the other fellow, one of the fellows, develops two other people or finds two other people he's interested in. What is this like in terms of reciprocity? Well, the man on the right now has two women who will accede to him, who have an incentive to please him. He tries to please both of them. The woman in the middle may find that she can't compete with the two women who have no alternatives. The guy on the left may find that his position vis-a-vis the woman in the middle has gotten better. Okay, but he's motivated. He's going, since he has no alternatives, he's going to want to go out with her a lot. He's going to want to do the kinds of things that she wants to do. If she is governed by the principle of reciprocity, then she's going to respond to his doing her favors by treating him nicely. Now, take the same story and imagine that the actors were motivated by exploitation instead. Okay, then the story becomes different. Then the middle two, man and woman, the woman in the middle and the guy on the right might maintain their relationship because the other people have no alternatives to them. Okay? They could, by maintaining the reality of their relationship, they could perhaps exploit the other individuals who have no alternatives to them. Keep them kind of hanging, and to kind of milk these relationships for as much as possible. This would be an instance of kind of the use of power because of dependence in the relationship. Now, there's an old tradition, and there's an old research tradition in social psychology called the power dependence approach, which basically states that the power of one person over another is equal to the dependence of the second person on the first. And this approach has been this is an old approach in social psychology. It started with Homans and Blau, and it was mostly a kind of dyadic approach within social psychology. It was used to explain, for instance, why in a marital couple, the person who had a job and came in contact with more people would have more alternative sources, more alternative possible relationships, and therefore would the other person, let's say if there was one person who worked outside the home and one person who didn't, the person who worked outside the home would have more power than the person who didn't work outside the home and had fewer alternative relationships. In the middle 80s, there were some social psychologists who broadened this approach by introducing networks. And for a while, actually, in the 1990s, there were a lot of social psychologists who attended these conferences. I was part of a group of social psychologists. Am I the only social psychologist who's here now? There are probably a few, but for a while there were lots of social psychologists who were joining who were trying to cast exchange theory or power dependence within a network framework. One of these social psychologists was Linda Malm, and she's still doing work on exchange theory within social networks. These are two of the networks that Malm has experimented on. And I want to focus on the network on the right, the four-person network. In Malm's experiment, she had the actors be able to reward each other with gifts. So they weren't bargaining over some kind of good, but they were rewarding one another with gifts of various sorts, with points that could be converted into money at the end of the experiment. And what she found was that reciprocity ruled. She found that the strongest thing that went on in these groups was reciprocity. People tended to reward those who rewarded them. What that meant in this experiment, interestingly enough, is that the lettering, unfortunately, is smaller than I had anticipated, but the vertices from the top from counterclockwise are A, B, C, and D. What she found is that A and B tended to exchange with each other, and C and D tended to exchange with each other. Now, why would B exchange exclusively with A rather than with C? who could offer him. Incidentally, I didn't mention that the bold lines, the regular lines, represent high numbers of points they could give each other, and the dotted line represents a pair who could only give each other a few points, many fewer points. So this was a much less valuable relationship than the AB, BC, or CD relationships. Why would A and B exchange with each other? Why did B choose to exchange with A rather than with C, with whom he could have potentially an equally valuable relationship? Well, the reason is that A found that his rewards from D were not very big. And so he was sending all his rewards to B. B was faced with two partners, one of whom rewarded him consistently, and the other of whom rewarded him inconsistently, that is, C. So what happened is, in part because A and D had no good alternative relationships, B and C found themselves faced with partners who were rewarding them consistently. And by the principle of reciprocity, they rewarded A and D consistently. Okay, now this is I think quite an interesting point, because in Malm's experiment, the subjects were not aware of the network as a whole. All they were aware of was who was rewarding them. If B and C had been more strategic, if they had been a little bit more, if they had been aware of the whole network and their position in it, they might have realized that they were in a position of some power. That in fact, A and D didn't have good alternative relationships. They could have rewarded A and D just a little bit. They would have received most of what A and D had to offer anyway. They could have rewarded A and D just a little bit, rewarded each other, and profited a lot more than they did. They could have exploited the dependence of B and D instead of behaving reciprocally. Now, Malm, in all of Malm's experiments, she kept the subjects ignorant of the network, so the subjects could not behave strategically. And I certainly agree that the principle of reciprocity is a strong one. But it's clear to me that in real life we do, or often we do, exploit others. Here's as I said, Malm found the principle of reciprocity. What would happen if what would happen in this experiment if B said to himself, if B were aware of the network as a whole and said to himself, how little do I have to reward A to keep him rewarding me? And how can I spend my time, let's say, encouraging C to reward me as well? Well, I conducted a little kind of computer simulation. What this shows is that B can maximize his rewards by rewarding his privileged partner C more, encouraging his rewards, and basically by throwing A bone occasionally. he's going to get A's rewards because A has no alternative sources of reward. What happens is that B doesn't have to reward A very often to get almost 100% of A's rewards if A behaves according to the principle of reciprocity. If A rewards the person most who's rewarding him. And he can, if he hardly ever rewards A, he still gets considerable rewards from his privileged partner C by the principle of reciprocity. Now here are some other networks that I'm going to be referring to later. Basically, I felt, well, yes, there's the norm of reciprocity, but I felt even if people don't always exploit, what if we had a model of exploitation? I mean, it's worth having a model for exploitation to understand when it does occur. Even if people are mostly pro-social, even if, trust and the norm of reciprocity and other kind of pro-social behaviors, cooperativeness, even if people are wired to behave in pro-social ways, it's nice to have a model of evil, a useful model of evil to describe and understand those kinds of conditions under which people do behave in a non-social, exploitative way. So, I assume that actors are out to maximize their power in a network. And they maximize, according to the power dependence model, they maximize their power over others by maximizing others' dependence on them. So, this is a definition of dependence. And I'm not going to go into the details, but basically it says that I'm assuming that dependence, that someone is dependent in proportion to the rewards they receive from ego. If you receive all your rewards from someone, you're highly dependent on them. If you receive only a tiny little proportion of your rewards from somebody else, then you're not very dependent on them. The example I was thinking of that recently occurred to me, was that the University of California is less and less dependent on the state of California because it receives less and less of its financing from, thank God, it receives less and less of its financing from the state. So this seemed to me like a plausible definition of dependence. It varies between 0 and 1. Now, power is having, since power over refers to dependence, having power means having others dependent on you. And what if we just measure power as the total dependence of others, your power over each of them, the sum of your power over each of them, as assessed by their dependence on you, and weighted, let's say, by how much they can reward you. You want power over people who are valuable to you. You can imagine. There's an assumption here. You can imagine people just wanting sheer power, including power over those who can't reward them. but it seemed to me more plausible that you'd want power over those who at least who can reward you. So power basically is the sum of the power you have over alters, where each alter is weighted by how much good he can do you. So maximizing power basically is maximizing power is distributing your resources, distributing your time and resources in such a way that you maximize others' dependence on you under the constraints that you only have so much resources and or time to allocate. So it's really a problem in calculus. I mean, in the model at least, it's a problem in calculus. It's allocating in such a way that you maximize total dependence. Well, if you think about it, if you think about the network that I described, the network on the right, B doesn't have to give A very much to create a great deal of dependence, since he's not getting much from anybody else. So it's not surprisingly, it's rational for A. Okay, now if I can get this. Is it okay? This is the principle of reciprocity. This is the Malm experiment. This is the Malm experiment. If I can get this to run again. Okay. The darkness of the lines refers to the strength of the frequency of the interaction. What happens is that this is reciprocity, as I've described it before. This is exploitation. Okay, where you notice that the circles describing the privileged positions are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So reciprocity, in which there is a maintenance of kind of equality, where in the end there's kind of equality. For some reason the thing loops through. At the end there's equality, versus reciprocity, in which the privileged positions get simply stronger and stronger. Now here's the four-person network again, described in terms where the length of the arrows describes the frequency of rewarding, and the size of the vertex refers to kind of the total amount of reward. In reciprocity, we have equality. This is on the left. In exploitation, we can see that in each of the dyads there is much more being received than being sent. I was thinking of kind of two little stories describing the difference between failure to reciprocate on the one hand, a kind of sin, and exploitation on the other. Imagine that you have a guest, a house guest, who doesn't pay any rent, kind of the man who came to dinner, someone who doesn't pay rent, someone who eats out of the refrigerator without ever replenishing the refrigerator. This is a person who is not reciprocating, maybe other previous favors. Now imagine, on the other hand, as an example of exploitation, imagine having a housekeeper who's an undocumented worker, and you can exploit this worker by paying below minimum wages and by making him or her work as hard as possible. You can exploit this person's dependence. this is the kind of thing that's occurring. This is a very different kind of evil, a very different kind of sin. It's a sin based on the exploitation of power differences. Okay, so here are some other networks in which I've done computer simulations. On the left, this is a network. This is the T. This is a net. Let's see. This is the network on the right, in which again the dotted lines are relationships that are not very valuable. The solid lines are relationships that are more valuable. And this is on the left side is what happens if people are governed by the principle of reciprocity. The DE pair exchange equally. On the right side is what happens if D is exploitative. D is faced with E is the bottom person. E has no alternatives at all. If D is aware of the situation, D can exploit E's dependence by not rewarding D very equally. And D will nevertheless receive rewards because E has no alternative. Here is a kind of a 5-person network. And here also the positions at the bottom, A and E, without any alternatives, get exploited. Even if if people were using the principle of reciprocity, then they would have some chance of being involved in an equal and reciprocal relationship. Now, I thought of a kind of pretentious example. It seems to me like all core periphery patterns are patterns in which some positions are privileged by having lots of connections, the core, and the periphery, of course, is defined really by having few connections. And this could be a dynamic exacerbating whatever economic tendencies there are in creating power differences between core and periphery countries. The very fact that periphery countries have fewer alternatives. There are just simply fewer alternative countries who have the capacity to use most of the time their natural resources. But I thought this was also an example. If you've watched as much I Love Lucy as I have, I've watched I Love Lucy for 3 generations of I Love Lucy. I've watched I Love Lucy when I was a child. I watched I Love Lucy when my children were young. And now occasionally I watch I Love Lucy. And it's clear that the power lies in Lucy and Ricky. And in part, it's because if you watch the program as much as I have, it's clear that the power is there. And it's undoubtedly because Ethel and Fred are completely without alternative partners. Okay, there's just no alternative partners for Ethel and well, in fact, the relationship between them is rather contentious. You hardly ever see them talk to each other. No conversations, almost, I would say if you went through systematically, okay, you would find almost no conversations between Ethel and Fred. It very rarely occurs. And of course, Fred and Lucy rarely talk except if Ethel is present. Ethel, I don't remember conversations between Ethel and Ricky. It's clear that this is the pattern of interaction, and I feel much more confident about this than I do about the world system. Okay, thank you.